Next, remembering one of the most celebrated authors of science fiction. Jeffrey Brown has our look.
Ray Bradbury was a modern master who helped bring the genre of science fiction writing into the cultural mainstream. And it began as a young boy with fairy tales.
And I got a book of fairy tales when I was 5 years old, and I fell in love with reading all these wonderful stories like Beauty and the Beast and Jack and the Beanstalk. So I began with fantasy.
Beginning in the early 1950s, Bradbury's books would sell more than 8 million copies. They include the short story collections The Martian Chronicles and The Illustrated Man, and his novels Fahrenheit 451 and Something Wicked This Way Comes. He also wrote poetry, plays,
He rises!
the screenplay for the 1956 movie Moby Dick.
I'm Ray Bradbury.
And hosted the Ray Bradbury Theater on television. Bradbury referred to himself as an idea writer, but one with a close eye on changes and the culture around him. This from a 1970s interview.
If I'm anything at all, I'm not really a science fiction writer. I'm a writer of fairy tales and modern myths about technology.
Bradbury won numerous literary awards and the National Medal of Arts in 2004. He died yesterday in Los Angeles at age 91. And we explore the life and legacy of Ray Bradbury with Lev Grossman, book critic for Time magazine and himself a best-selling writer. His novels include The Magicians and The Magician King. Lev, perhaps first for those who haven't read Ray Bradbury or not in a long time, what do you think made him such an important writer in American literary life?
Well, you know, you come to him as a science fiction writer, but as soon as you start reading him, you start to realize that he's doing things that you didn't realize that science fiction could do. I mean, I came to him after reading writers like Heinlein, who are thrilling and exciting, but with Bradbury, you started weeping, you were terrified, you were happy, you were laughing. He took you places psychologically that science fiction writers didn't usually go, or didn't go before then. He was exploring outer space, but in essence, he was really exploring inner space. He was sort of taking you on a journey, the inner space in your unconscious.
There's a wonderful interview in print he did with the Paris Review that I was reading today, and he said, when I was a young writer, if you went to a party and told somebody you were a science fiction writer, you would be insulted. They would call you Flash Gordon all evening or Buck Rogers. So he really had to sort of fight his way in past the sort of sense of the genre as a lesser type of writing.
Well, it's funny, he did, and he did it because he was as smart as the guys who were writing literary fiction, and he wrote better than they did. He was interested in words and language in a way that very few science fiction writers, or even any writers, are. He was so good that they had to acknowledge him. They had to acknowledge that science fiction was just another kind of literature as good as any other. And the funny thing is, he didn't really seem to care that much. He thought of himself as a writer. He loved what he did, and people could like it or not. It was all the same to him.
Well, how did he see his writing and science fiction? Also in that interview, he referred to science fiction as the fiction of ideas. And I said in our intro, he referred to himself as an idea writer. So what do we know about how he saw himself as doing?
Well, he was certainly one of the early cautionary voices about technology, about where it was taking us, about how technology was changing us, even as it was developing. The tools we were using affect who we are and how we live and what our culture is. He was one of the first people to kind of pay attention to that feedback loop and think about where it was taking us. And that was a revelation, and many writers do it now, but he was among the first and best.
And that we should set the context there. That starts in the 1950s, right? The post-war, Cold War, the beginnings of going to space, and also the fears of nuclear war.
Yes, well, he presided over this, this period in the 20th century that saw so much incredible change, the rise of digital computers, space travel, nuclear war. And he was one of these wise, skeptical voices who kind of kept us centered and on track and gave us a sense of perspective that, these things were amazing, but they were also terrifying, and they could take us to dark places that maybe we didn't realize.
And I saw a list today, people are putting out lists of things from his writing that eventually came true, that seemed crazy at the time, but they did come true.
He said often, I'm not writing to describe the future or predict it, I'm writing to prevent it. And I think what he meant by that was he wrote cautionary tales that allowed us to kind of head things off of the past before they happened.
Where do you see his legacy today? What writers, what kind of writing?
Well, he was, one of the early writers who really transcended any sort of sense of boundary between science fiction and literature, and there have been so many writers who do that since then. Kurt Vonnegut, an obvious example, Philip K. Dick, but also later writers like Michael Chabon, Jonathan Lethem, Kazuo Ishiguro, Neil Gaiman, writers who write, in a way that defines themselves both as literary writers and as genre writers, and shows that there isn't really any great difference between the two.
Do you have a favorite one before we go? Do you have a favorite book or story that you want to recommend to people?
Well, Martian Chronicles for me is always the masterpiece. This idea that we could go to Earth, to another place, to another planet, and go there only to sort of re-encounter these sort of dark spirits from our own unconsciousness. It was such a beautiful and powerful idea. That's the one that stays with me.
All right, the life, work, and legacy of Ray Bradbury. Lev Grossman, thanks so much.
Thank you.